Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Welcome to everyone here with us in person and to those joining via webinar. It is a true honor to have you with us for the 2026 Freedom in the World Launch Report. Pivotal elections, criminal violence, and targeting of social space in the Americas. This event is presented by the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University in partnership with the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center and Freedom House. Founded in 1941, Freedom House is a US-based non-governmental organization dedicated to advancing democracy, political freedom, and human rights around the world through rigorous research and analysis. Today's program is also made possible through the collaboration with the Ruth and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, the Vaclav Havel Program for Human Rights and Democracy, and the Dorothea Green Lecture Series. We gather at a critical moment for the Americas. The region faces pressing challenges, from pivotal elections that will shape democratic path to rising criminal violence and increasing constraints on civil society and fundamental freedoms. Understanding these issues is vital for policymakers, scholars, and institutions like FIU that are committed to fostering informed dialogue and advancing solutions for a more secure and democratic hemisphere. Thank you again for being part of this important conversation, and it is now my distinct pleasure to invite Dr. Shlomi Dinar, Dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, to deliver the opening remarks. Dr. Dinar, thank you.
You need me to speak into a microphone, or can I just speak regular? You do? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Claudia, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shlomi Dinar, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure to be Dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. And on behalf of Florida International University, the Green School, and the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, I'm absolutely honored to welcome you to today's launch of Freedom in the World 2026. At the Green School, we are deeply committed to fostering informed dialogue on the most pressing global challenges. Today's event reflects that commitment, bringing together scholars and practitioners to examine the state of political rights and civil liberties around the world. This year's report offers a sobering assessment of democracy in 2025, and today's focus on the Americas is both timely and necessary. Across the hemisphere, we are witnessing profound political shifts. Democratic institutions are facing mounting strain, from electoral manipulation that weakens checks and balances to the growing influence of organized crime that undermines governance and public trust. At the same time, civic space is narrowing in many countries, limiting the ability of individuals and communities to participate fully in democratic life. These trends are complex and deeply interconnected, and they demand careful analysis as well as a thoughtful response. Today's discussion will help us better understand not only the challenges facing the region, but also the opportunities for strengthening democratic resilience. The work behind Freedom in the World reminds us of the importance of rigorous, independent analysis in shaping policy and public discourse. It also underscores the role that academic institutions like ours can play in advancing knowledge, informing action, and training the next generation of leaders. I'd like to thank our partners and guest speakers from Freedom House for their continued leadership in advancing conversations on democracy, governance, and human rights. And may I add also a personal anecdote, which I think I shared with you, Gerardo, when we met on Zoom some months ago, that I'm an avid user of Freedom House in several of the classes that I used to teach on globalization, and I always use the various indices that Freedom House produces and the research it produces. It's top notch. So I wanted to add that as well. So I look forward to a thoughtful and engaging discussion, and it is now my pleasure to introduce the Interim Director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center, Dr. Jose Miguel Cruz. Thank you.
Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to be brief. I know we want to listen about and see the results of the report. I just want to say that on behalf of the Kimberly Green Latin American Caribbean Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of the Freedom of the World Pivotal Elections, Counter-Violence and Targeting of Civil Space in the Americas. We're extremely grateful to have you join us for this conversation. As LAC, Green School, and FIU, we see events like today's not simply as presentations or findings, but also as opportunities for critical engagement. They allow us to bring scholarship, data, actual data, and regional expertise into dialogue with current realities, what is happening in the world, and to equip our students and the broader public with the tools to understand political change with rigor. We're honored today to host the launch and to convene a discussion that speaks directly to our region, our research mission, and our civic responsibility. We hope this conversation sparks thoughtful debate and continued engagement beyond today. I want to thank Gerardo Berthin, Félix Madariaga, who is on Zoom, Alejandra Argueta, and the team of Freedom House for partnering with us and helping to expand our serious discussions about democracy and freedom. I also want to thank our professor, Guilherme Casarões, Eduardo Gamarra, who's also on Zoom, for joining the discussion today. And also I want to thank the Green School and the Bacla Habel Program for Human Rights and Democracy for the support for this event. And to you all for being here. Welcome. Let's talk about freedom in the Americas, for real. Now let me turn to Gerardo Berthin, President of Freedom House, who will be presenting the report. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back here in Florida International University. This is, I think, the second time we have done this over the past 3 years, and we look forward to continue basically this partnership. I do want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Dinar and as well as Jose Miguel Cruz and his team for making this possible, as well as Eduardo, somebody that I know for a long time, former colleague of mine, Felix, of course, with whom we work together at Freedom House, and Guilherme actually for accepting to have comments. Oops. There we go. So this is our 53 Freedom in the World report. We have been doing this since 1973. And the title of this year's report should give you a little bit of pause for reflection. It's called The Growing Shadow of Autocracy. Freedom in the World is a project that assesses political rights and civil liberties experienced by individuals. In this sense, it is an indicator that is people-centered. There are other indicators that measure democratic performance, such as the variety of democracies or the democracy index of the Economy Intelligence Unit and others. But ours is basically the one that analyzes the conditions for liberties and rights as shrined in the Universal Human Rights Declaration. Our methodology has 25 indicators, and they are based, again, on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we assess 195 countries and 13 territories. And as you will see, we have a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 is not free and 100 is free. And then basically we made this particular map very famous with the colors, where we, based on the score, we categorize countries into not free, it's the purple color, the partially free, which is the green, yellow color, and the green color, which is free. As you can see, I was doing this presentation before, and someone said, well, why is the West green and the East purple? Well, it's not as simple as that, as you will see. We do this actually in collaboration with a network of analysts all over the world, actually, plus 150 of them that work with us every year. And certainly it allows us to have a very solid and rigid methodology that actually reveals both increases and decreases over the year. So unfortunately, the headline of this year's report is that global freedom has declined for the 20 consecutive year in 2025. I just want to stress that we are looking at data of the calendar year of 2025, from January to December of 2025. It does not include data from this year. The political rights and civil liberties worsen, as you can see, in 54 countries and improve in just 35 of the 208 countries and territories that we analyze. What that means is that basically in 2025, declines in freedom were felt by 40% of the world's population, while only 7% of the world's population experienced improvements. Two main factors, I think, drove this dramatic score change last year. Military coups are back, and certainly there is an effort, particularly of incumbent leaders, to hold into power through violence and manipulation. This year, we have the largest decline, which was caused by a military coup in the African country of Guinea-Bissau, minus 8 points. Tanzania is another country that recorded its second largest decline following a brutal crackdown on peaceful dissent. Burkina Faso and Madagascar are other countries that actually also decline because of increased violence and, let's say, repression against religious minorities in these countries. If we go to another region, in Georgia and Serbia, they decreased 4 and 3%, 3 points respectively, due basically to disproportionate force against anti-government protesters and threatened to retaliate against any critic. That is a little bit the global picture, and definitely a number of the declines, as you can see, if we go back, particularly the last 20 years, this is one of our anniversary reports. We had a chance to look at our data 20 years back from 2005 and begin to see trends. And this is a chart actually that allows you to see a little bit the trend from 2005 and 2025. And one of the headlines here, which I'll talk about and I can answer any questions, is that of all of the 3 categories that Freedom House analyzes, the partially free, the yellow countries, are the ones that actually over the last 20 years have diminished the most. And unfortunately, these are countries that are not going to the green side. These are countries that are going to the purple side. In that sense, basically, it is one of our headlines to understand that most countries are actually that are partially free are moving in the wrong direction, according to our opinion. Certainly, the reasons of why these declines are happening around the world happen to be, again, coup d'etats, violence and armed conflict, the erosion of democratic institutions, and certainly an increase in authoritarian repression. Now, if we go and kind of focus on Latin America, we look at Latin America around 35 countries of the Americas, and that includes the United States, it includes Canada, and it includes all of the non-English, non-Spanish-speaking countries of the Caribbean region. And as you can see, certainly 72% of the population of our region live in free countries, where only 6%, although once we begin to disaggregate that, we begin to see a little bit some of the nuances of this data. Nonetheless, basically, looking deeply and analyzing the causalities of these trends, we can actually begin to understand, as I will show, some of the concerns that we are seeing in the region. So if we look at the Americas, this group of countries, the 35, and we look at this year's trends, we can see that over the year, there are 3 countries that actually have declined the most, and they are El Salvador, which is rated partially free. The United States is a country, actually one of the free countries in our report, along with Italy and Bulgaria, that actually has declined 3 points, and Haiti that has declined -2. This should give you a little bit of a headline to say that no matter which category you are, partially free, not free, or free, there could still be movement in a sense, right? And basically the countries that actually have increased in their rating, here are the 6 countries, are Brazil, Suriname, Jamaica, Trinidad, Uruguay, and the headline in the region was Bolivia. Bolivia, for the first time since 2002, became a free country, and that's as a result of the transition that they made peacefully from an authoritarian regime that had been in power for 20 years to a much more democratic and pluralistic regime. If we look at the 20-year trend, we see a different picture. We see 4 countries, actually, that have shown the most decline in the region. Nicaragua is not only the largest in our region, but is one of the biggest, if not the largest in the world, globally. Venezuela is another country that has declined 41 points. El Salvador is another country that has declined 33 points over the past 20 years. And Mexico is another country that has declined 22 points over the last decades. And in terms of the countries that actually have increased points over the 20 years are Jamaica, Antigua and Barbuda, Trinidad and Tobago, and Colombia, although, as you will see in our analysis, if you look at our webpage, there are nuances in these particular countries as well. I just want to show the trend that is interesting to analyze, which is these 4 countries that I mentioned that have the largest 20-year declines. Definitely, the trend is downward, and in many cases, they have begun to lose categories. Now, Freedom House is a very conservative methodological, it uses a very conservative methodological regime. For us to actually change a category, something really major needs to happen. And in these particular countries that I'm showing, Mexico, the last time Mexico was a free country was in 2010. So in 2010, it began to actually decrease even farther for partially free. Venezuela was a partially free country until 2016. Then it became not free. Nicaragua was a partially free country until 2018, and then it declined to not free. And El Salvador actually was a free country until 2019 as well. So, definitely, if we look at the region, one of the things that we are seeing is that over the last 20 years, autocrats have converted the structures and resources of the state into weapons with which to attack their opponents. And we can have different examples. Bolivia is one of them, of course, of the last 20 years. El Salvador can be another interesting example to analyze further. And the deepening of authoritarianism has contributed to this particular repression. And certainly there, even though it's not mentioned in the slide, Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua are the countries that actually have deepened around the region and the world, basically, authoritarian tendencies. So the democratic erosion is another interesting element that we find in our report. Leaders who took office after credible elections are subverting democracy. And one thing that we tend to argue over these presentations is that in today's world, everybody wants elections, including autocrats, because elections are actually a way to legitimize their power. So Putin in Russia holds election, the Cubans have elections, Daniel Ortega holds elections, China has elections, but certainly one can argue that the quality of elections actually also matter. Some of the largest declines of the last 20 years have the result of democratic erosion, and certainly attacking institutions and changing constitutions to maintain power are some of the trends that we're seeing in the region. And I just want to leave you with a little bit of hope as well, because we also had some bright spots. Bolivia, I mentioned at the beginning, it's one of the countries that actually provided this year. But there are other countries that actually have, in one way or another, show some resilience. Guatemala, for example, is a country that last year made a very important transition. And this year, despite the fact that the institutions continue to be attacked, there was a certain level of institutional stability. Democracies remain resilient, actually. The 23 Americas countries rated free today were also free in 2005, which shows actually that once, and I think we have some data in our data bank that proves that once you are crossing into the free category, it is probably more challenging, but not impossible to sustain yourself in that category. And the other theory also is valid, which is once you go into the not free category, it becomes more difficult every year to actually come back from the black hole. In our Freedom in the World, and you can see this when you go online, we have developed basically recommendations, and these are three basically that are very important. One thing that particularly as a result of the reduction of US foreign aid for democratic activities is the reimagination of how to support international democracy. We are at an inflection point. Whatever we have before 2025 in foreign assistance, particularly from the US and other donors, is not coming back. So we have to be very creative in understanding basically how we can continue to support democracies, not to go back to net free in our framework, but actually to help them actually graduate into free societies. Definitely one of the institutional structures that has been attacked over the past 20 years, and also we highlight for this year, is the anti-corruption infrastructure. Latin America was a leader 20 years ago. For those of you who don't know, Latin America was the first continent in the world to have an anti-corruption convention, the Inter-American Convention, which in other places was born in Venezuela, in Caracas. In fact, actually, that was the last time that I was in Caracas, Venezuela in 2006, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. I was a bit worried that Chavez was already in power, whether I could leave or not Caracas, because the headline in the Universal was that I had said something that Venezuela was actually sliding into corruption. Well, I was able to leave Caracas, luckily, yeah. And certainly, one of the things that we actually analyze in our report is autocrats have mastered the art of collaborating and copying and editing and doing things the same. Democracies have not, unfortunately. And we need to start actually supporting better coordination among democracies and understanding that working together in coalition actually is much better than working unilaterally. So I want to thank you again. I'm going to leave some of these social media and worldwide access to our data. They're there. You can download the report. You'll also be able to see other reports that we're doing, including our Freedom of the Net, which was published in November. And just a little bit of a PR, if you allow me, tomorrow, we are actually publishing our newest transnational repression report with data from 2025. So with that, I know that we have commentaries, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerardo. We're gonna start a discussion, and for that we're going to first hear the comments from our panelists. We have two panelists online, Félix Madariaga, who is member of the board of Freedom House, and also Professor Eduardo Gamarra, who's a professor in the Politics International Department here. And with us here is also Professor Guilherme Casarões from the Politics International Department. I just want to make a comment on what we've seen today. Obviously, there are good news and bad news, right? The good news is, as Gerardo wrapped it, basically, we still have most of our countries are democracies in the region, and that's good news. The bad news is that there are some who have slid into, he put it in the purple side, but I would say the dark side, right? They're going into the dark side. Some of them, obviously, the most glaring case, in my opinion, is the case of El Salvador, obviously. And I just want to, and that has to do a lot with the issue of crime, right? I just want to comment that many years ago, 25 years ago, I was visiting the University of Pittsburgh with Professor Mitchell Seligson, and we're discussing, how to anticipate the threats for democracy in the region then, right? And in the America's Barometer, there wasn't still America's Barometer then because he hadn't created the whole project, but he was doing these surveys across in different parts of the region, and he has this inventory of questions about coup d'etats, right? Reasons for coup d'etats, and we had, at that time, we have economic crisis, we have corruption, we have social instability, but we didn't have crime. At that moment, people didn't tend to see crime as a threat to democracy. And because of what was happening already in Central America, right, with the rise of gangs and criminal organizations, we discussed that we introduced this question about support for the coup d'etat because of crime. Unfortunately, some of that, even though we haven't had a coup d'etat recently, but certainly crime has become a factor, an important factor in the discussion. So I just wanted to say, to point that as the complexities of democracy in the region and freedom in the region. And with that, I'll stop talking and I will ask my colleagues, first Félix Madariaga, then Guilherme Casarões, and then Professor Gamarra to give us their comments, their remarks on the report. Félix?
Well, good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you, all of you, for this opportunity. Let me begin by congratulating Freedom House for continuing the very important work of the Freedom in the World report. In a time when democratic erosion is no longer episodic, it's systemic. This report remains one of the clearest and most credible instruments we have to understand the condition of liberty across the globe. And of course, Gerardo, thank you for your presentation. I'd like to acknowledge Dean Dinar, the wonderful team at FIU, Claudia, Jose Miguel, Alejandra, and of course, my dear friend Eduardo, and the rest of the panelists. Always a pleasure to be here. I feel at home. As you know, I've been a fellow at the Adam Smith Center, so it's always wonderful to be here. Going back to Gerardo's presentation, it is especially meaningful. I was just doing some math, Jose Miguel, and Gerardo. We've been working together for about 20 years. I remember talking with Gerardo about the intersection of corruption and democracy about 20 years ago. It's a reminder of how quickly time passes, and yet one reflects on that arc of time. One realizes something sobering. Even back in 2006, many of the warning signs of democratic erosion in the region were visible. And we're witnessing today something that is not isolated national crisis. We see a global pattern around the world. Democracy is under pressure from both old and new forces. We see the concentration of executive power, the corrosion of institutions, the manipulation of information, the weakening of multilateral resolve. The UN, quite frankly, is not delivering, and a growing confidence of autocratic actors are becoming more sophisticated. So democracy is not always overthrown dramatically. It's eroded gradually. We see institutions that are emptied. You see, as Gerardo reminded us, elections, yes, they continue to occur, but they're robbed. Courts continue to function, but too often as instruments of political intimidation. And here, I want to underscore a theme of relevance, which is the increasing proximity between corruption, organized crime, and authoritarianism. There is a deep connection between regimes that, with one hand, steal elections, with the other hand, they divert public funds, they protect criminal networks, they corrupt the police and the armed forces, they weaponize the judicial system. My own country, Nicaragua, under the Sandinista dictatorship, is a clear example of a kleptocracy. And we see that it's not only a problem for governance, it's a problem of higher sophisticated autocracy that gains political control, illicit finance, impunity. So we must pay close attention to a phenomenon that is becoming quite complicated. They're collaborating. We see, for example, transnational repression. By this, I mean the methods through which these regimes go beyond their borders to threaten, to monitor, to harass, to silence dissidents in exile, often using intimidation and pursuing legal harassment, defamation, immigration-related pressure, or the manipulation of the democratic legal systems in the very countries where exiles seek refuge. In other words, authoritarianism is no longer domestic. It has become cross-border. It's become adaptive. And yet, in this difficult landscape, we are convinced that civil society remains the most vital force for democratic recovery. Let's think about journalists, human rights defenders, faith communities, student movements, democratic activists. Civil society is often democracy's last line of defense and its first source of renewal. This is why initiatives such as the World Liberty Congress matter. It is, in essence, an example of democratic dissidents and civil society leaders from around the world working together across borders, precisely because dictatorships also work together across borders. If authoritarian regimes collaborate, those who defend freedom must learn to collaborate with equal seriousness, courage, and a strategic purpose. So this conversation cannot be more timely. We're here not only to diagnose decline, but to think seriously about democratic resilience, civic courage, and the forms of democratic solidarity. So I very much look forward to the conversation with my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix. We'll hear now from Guilherme Casarões, Professor Casarões.
Thank you, Jose Miguel. Thank you, Gerardo. Thank you, the other panelists as well. I'm very happy to be here. And just like Dean Dinar, I've also been using every single resource from Freedom House in my classes, from research methods to theories of international relations and democracy. So basically, everything's pretty much there. So thank you for this opportunity of being able to discuss the results of the 2026 report. I have three basic ideas. After reading the report, I kind of tried to find points in common that I would like to elaborate on. And I think that there are three things that the report shows. And of course, if we go back to the reports from previous years, you're also going to see a very important trend regarding these things that I'm going to be talking about. So I think that these are important ideas that we can, of course, discuss further in the Q&A. The first of these ideas is that authoritarianism has no color. This is important because it's become commonplace among political scientists to associate the rise of the far right with the rise of authoritarianism. And many times they forget, or they just turn a blind eye to authoritarian forces on the left, who are also undermining institutions, who are also persecuting journalists, who are also silencing opponents. So I think, as Felix has very well pointed out, I think there's a clash right now between old forces and new forces, and apparently the left that has grown more and more authoritarian with time, it's an older left most of the time, and the right is much of a younger right in many ways. But despite the generational gap, I think it's important to reinforce the idea that ideology doesn't necessarily play a role in defining whether a country is going to be authoritarian or democratic in the long run. And again, I think that's important because it helps us look at what's going on in the world from a more rigorous perspective, rather than a passionate approach to one side or the other. The second idea that I'd like to talk about is that technology matters. And I think that Gerardo has very correctly pointed out that there's something that the right-wing authoritarians have been doing beautifully, with a lot of success over the last 10 years at least, which is they cooperate with one another. They have formed this massive transnational network of not only like-minded leaders, but leaders who deliberately share the same playbook, the same talking points, the very same ideas. Sometimes I'm from Brazil originally, so sometimes I see what for example, Bolsonaro family is saying in Brazil, and it's just a translated copy of the Trump playbook, the Orban playbook, sometimes the Modi playbook. So it's interesting to see that these ideas, they circulate very rapidly. And this is not just because of this coordination between these different actors from all over the world, but also this is thanks to social media and technology. So when I refer to technology, I'm not only referring to technology in the sense that they have a technique in the way they do politics, but also they resort to new technologies in much more efficient ways than any other political force in the world. It's kind of embarrassing to see how the left sometimes deals with social media. Maybe we have exceptions out there, like New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani, who's been very efficient in doing this. But most of the time, maybe because the left is older than the right, we kind of see this troubling relationship with social media that also hampers their ability to reach out to more and more people. There's something else about technology that I'd like to point out very quickly, which is the role of religion. Religion also provides a very interesting playbook for authoritarian leaders. And I think there lies another difference between left and right in this regard, because even though you can see left-wing authoritarians tapping into religion, and they do it many times, but religion, and more specifically religious nationalism, has become a very important force that in a way replaces, especially if you're talking about a population who's sick and tired of traditional politics, it replaces the traditional forms of politics with something transcendental that's actually pretty dangerous, because it challenges the very separation between church and state. It challenges our very notions of democratic politics to begin with. So this is also something that I think, both in the social media realm and the religion factor, it kind of, the right is faring better than the left in this regard. And this is also important to take note of. Finally, cooperation matters. And we've mentioned the transnational connections between far-right leaders globally. But I think that the conclusion of the report points towards the importance of international cooperation to promote democracy as well. And I totally agree with you. I remember a couple of years ago, Lula from Brazil and Pedro Sanchez from Spain, they gathered at the United Nations to promote like a democracy forum, which was pretty underwhelming at the end of the day, mostly because those who were there were pretty much left-wing politicians or center-left politicians. And it was kind of embarrassing. So I think that leaders who are committed to democracy must take note that it's important, it's essential to cooperate. Now, there's a problem. And the problem is we're talking about cooperation, international cooperation to promote democracy. And this is fundamental. I think that we have several different case studies that show that this is something with great consequences in the long run. But we also have to think, and that's my final thought, we have to think about domestic cooperation as well. One of the biggest challenges to democracies is not just institutional resilience. This is, of course, something important. But one of the challenges is sometimes political forces, just because they disagree ideologically, they are not willing to cooperate and they are not willing to work together to safeguard democracy. I hope truly that the 2027 report will be able to highlight the results of the elections in Hungary, for example, in which left and right kind of cooperated to kick Orban out of power. We are probably going to see something along the same lines in Peru, depending on how things go in the country. Maybe in Colombia, we're also seeing the center regaining strength. And I hope that's the case of Brazil as well. So in a nutshell, I think that left and right inside countries, if they want to preserve democracy, they have to cooperate and work together in order to safeguard democracy in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Guilherme. Let's hear now from Professor Gamarra.
Yes, thank you very much, Jose Miguel. I have to apologize. I didn't count on not being there in person, but traffic between our North Campus and our South Campus is, as all of you know, quite difficult. So I wasn't going to make it on time, and I'm especially sad that I can't say hello to Gerardo Berthin, who I was really looking forward to talking to you in person. So thank you nonetheless for allowing me to share some comments on this very, very significant report. I mean, this is clearly a benchmark report that all of us have been using for decades, and it's particularly gratifying to see Gerardo Berthin now directing this. And now I want to, I've never been one to shy from controversy. So, and I've noticed how in some measure, perhaps one of the most significant findings of this report has to do really with what I think the report says at the beginning of that there is democratic backsliding that's occurring in several places around the world, and that trend is really significant. And one of the things that the report says is that, it's the return of coups and so on, particularly in Africa. But I want to start out by noting that democratic backsliding appears to be occurring in very different ways right now, and that perhaps coups aren't that important. And I'll note that this report says that really there is democratic backsliding going on in the United States. And this is less than, it stems not from a single rupture, but from the cumulative weakening of institutions, of norms and freedoms. So the warning from this report, I would say, about countries with long, let us say, institutionalized democracies, that the danger is that the deterioration of democracy is a gradual, legally framed process. And therefore, as Gerardo noted in his presentation, it's much harder to reverse before it becomes entrenched. Okay, and I want to repeat that. And it's harder to reverse a process of democratic backsliding if it is done in this way, gradually, legally framed, right? And I think that that's a warning for what appears to be happening in the United States. But I was asked to talk about Bolivia, and since Gerardo is Bolivian, I want to spend a little bit of time of talking about Bolivia. Bolivia was upgraded, and that was the good news in this report, and at least for the region. And I think that the new classification for Bolivia is certainly welcome, and I agree with it mostly, right? And the core reasons that the report says is, there were competitive elections that were held, state institutions resisted political interference, an opposition victory occurred, and power was transferred peacefully, right? That essentially results in what I might call a minimalist democratic threshold. Good enough, right? Elections are credible, they're competitive, they're decisive, and the incumbents left power, right? After really having been in power for 20 years, right? And so in that sense, Bolivia today meets that baseline that Freedom House says, right, for being free. So Bolivia has crossed that electoral integrity threshold, right, which is really very heavily weighted in your index. And I think in that sense, right, you basically got a methodological issue here that you're saying electoral integrity plus alternation in power equals to democratic recovery. So my question then, and just really for argument's sake, I guess, is does Bolivia really fit this partly free case, right? And I'm arguing that yes, there's a strong case to be made. But when we look at some of the things that Bolivia is facing and that President Paz is facing, for example, on the weak rule of law and judicial politicization count, right? The courts in Bolivia are highly politicized. Judicial selection mechanisms are still very discredited, right? And there are including charges that the law is still being used instrumentally against opposition, right? So on the rule of law component, maybe we're still talking about a work in progress. But also the persistence of informal power structures. And this is a place where I've been doing a little bit of work lately. And it has to do with a persistent role of cocalero networks and some corporatist actors, right? That really blur the boundaries between state, party, and social movements, particularly in some regional power centers. I would argue that central Bolivia, especially the Chapare Valley. Some might even make the case for Santa Cruz as a regional power center, right? And this suggests, though, that that formal democracy continues to coexist with informal governance systems. And this has been, of course, a characteristic of Bolivia, and it really tells you how you have a weak state still that may not have full control over a number of parts of the country. And this leads to a third issue that, again, I've been working on this for many, many years, and perhaps the most, to me, the most analytically significant issue right now, and underweighed by the Freedom House report, is that Bolivia remains a major cocaine transit and production hub, right? And there is great evidence of a coexistence rather than a confrontation between state actors and illicit networks, right? And of course, more than anything else, there's limited enforcement capacity in key regions like the Chapare, where you might say that the Chapare has become kind of an independent republic within Bolivia, governed by Evo Morales, who incidentally received a tremendous backing in recent subnational elections. So you have what might be argued is that one of the threats to democracy continues to be criminal sovereignty over some parts of Bolivian territory. And then finally, I'll end with this, that Bolivia still suffers from a deep cleavage between the MAS and opposition forces, other opposition forces, but a deep cleavage with the state now run by Rodrigo Paz, and with a big challenge of trying to bring that sector under control. And so in a sense, I would say that, that there is a risk of institutional breakdown in future elections if these non-state actors, narcotics-related actors are not fully brought into control. So again, I agree in general, and I'm very pleased by the report in upgrading Bolivia, but I still have some of these very significant concerns that really have a potential of undermining democratic governance in Bolivia. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Before continuing with some question, I want to give opportunity to Gerardo to react to the comments of the panelists.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think certainly all of these comments have been very valid, and that's the purpose of the report, is to generate conversations around it and at least confirm that other analyses, which I mentioned also in one way or another, confirm the trajectories and the tendencies, and they begin to actually, as Eduardo and Guilherme and Félix began to actually disaggregate the different nuances that each country has. I think I'll go first to Eduardo's comments. I think his comments are very valid, and we have cases in our data. I will cite Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, in which they became free and then they went back to partially free. And so that is, of course, something that we're going to continue to look. And the challenge really is on the conditions to be actually kept sustained. And certainly there's no magic formula to do that. Different countries have different regions. I was actually talking to the Finnish ambassador in Washington not long ago because Finland is 100 in our score for at least the past 20 years. I asked her, what is your formula? Why is Finland basically the freest country in the world? And her answer was very simple. Says, well, because probably we are small, number one, and second, we have tended to invest in our communities. That's what she said. So certainly Brazil is an interesting case. I was talking before the presentation that of all of the countries that show these tendencies in our index to decline, it is Brazil. It is a steady decline, even though this year maybe there is a little bit of a pause, but still is a country that remains free. And one of the reasons that we highlight is particularly it's a strong judicial institutions. If there is a trend over the last 20 years in our data is that there are no longer easy answers in terms of structural, let's say, factors supporting democracy. What we're saying is there still are, but they're no longer sufficient because of all of other elements, including basically social media and technology. Definitely, I like the point of bringing the issue of religion, actually, in politics. Brazil, in particular, is one country that has undergone such experience. And even some candidates actually are openly faith-based leaders, in a sense. So I thought that was very interesting. One of the indicators, by the way, of the 25 indicators in the liberties bucket is freedom of religion. And certainly we'll like to look at that over time. But at least in places like Africa and the Middle East, it is a factor that has continued to be a concern. Félix will be somebody who can also speak about the issue of religion and authoritarianism, because Nicaragua is also another country that actually has not only overtaken religious freedom literally, but certainly attacks are becoming actually much more explicit. So, on Miguel's point about El Salvador, I lived in El Salvador for a few years, and certainly it presents a dilemma in a way that, at least in principle, the problem that was there supposedly is not there anymore. The question is whether the methods that were used to actually get rid of the problem. And certainly our data at least supports the fact that freedom of the media, freedom of personal opinion, and due process are some of these particular areas that democratically elected leaders, like in the case of El Salvador, actually have begun to utilize. And as Felix was mentioning, the whole issue of transnational repression, and particularly now that El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have actually organically expelled citizens, actually, in places like Colombia, Costa Rica, among others. We're beginning to see also the fact that those countries that receive these particular exiles were not prepared for that, and particularly if they are human rights defenders. There's an argument to be made that human rights defenders in particular have to be treated a little bit different than just regular refugees, because they're escaping basically a consistent form of repression, and that is following wherever they go.
Thank you, Gerardo. I want to turn to you, Felix, on some of the points that Gerardo mentioned. And well, you and I collaborated 10 years ago, maybe, on a project on civil society in Nicaragua, and then we'll continue working on other places in Central America on the role of civil society. And one of the points underlined by the report is sort of the reduction of civic spaces, right? As a very concerning indicator of what's happening across the region. But Nicaragua particularly was clear 10 years ago. Salvador became. So my question for you, Felix, is how do we empower civil society in those cases, for those cases that are still free, partly free, but have seen those spaces being reduced, being closed? How do we empower, civil society organizations? How can we think of ways in which civil society can continue doing their work in favor of freedoms and rights?
That is a very important question, because as I highlighted on my opening remarks, civil society is often the front line of freedom, way before political parties can actually be actors that will face autocratic forces. I will use the Nicaraguan case study, but you can think about this in many other countries around the world. When the Sandinista party lost the elections in 1990, a lot of people forget that the transition protocol allowed the Sandinista party to remain in full control of the military and in full control of partial control of the police and the intelligence services. It was a civil society, particularly through institutions such as the Instituto de Estudios Estratégicos and so on, that actually started to educate public opinion on why civilian control over the armed forces was important. The Violeta Chamorro administration didn't consider that necessarily a key element, nor other political parties. So it took a long time for the political actors to understand that democratic transition in Nicaragua was not going to be successful without civilian control. And I can give the same example around issues of transparency that Gerardo and I have collaborated in many other parts of the world. I've done it with you as well. Before people can understand why tackling corruption is important, academia, civil society, activists are the ones that educate. So civil society has a pedagogic role, an educational role to raise the bar in terms of building the basic civic infrastructure. To your question, how can we help? It requires resources, so that's the most obvious one, and I must say that despite the fact that we all know that USAID had certain issues, the collapse of USAID has actually created a major problem, not only USAID, but other agencies, because there's insufficient philanthropy to support investigative journalists, to support student movements, to support women movements. So one obvious thing we could do is to invest in philanthropy and educate the philanthropic world. Actually, here at the University of Virginia, I'm dedicating a lot of time in educating the private sector, in investing in civil society. Academia has a role because a lot of the wonderful research that institutions such as FIU produce, for example, is not necessarily digestible for activists. So we need to provide wisdom, knowledge, research that is actionable and that civil society actors can play. I have many other ideas, but due to the limited time we have, I stick to the importance of supporting activists through funding and other resources. But I cannot stop with one more, which is immigration protection. You see that civil society activists around the world are having a hard time to travel, a hard time to do their work, and they require special immigration protection as well.
Thank you, Felix. We certainly, in the Green School, and the dean won't let me lie about this, we're certainly working on translating a lot of what we produce here into something that can be, used by our community, right? Actionable research. So certainly that's a great point. Guilherme, on this point of the decline or the erosion of institutions, right? A key point, and Gerardo was mentioning this, a key point is around the independence of the courts, of the judiciary, right? And in the case of Brazil, Brazil has been an interesting case because it went from administration that was moving into authoritarianism into one that apparently has stopped that trend for a while. But yet, in doing that, also the courts have intervened, and some people have accused the role of the courts as lawfare, right? As using the courts basically to punish the rivals, the enemies. So how can we differentiate between those cases in which you have certainly independent courts doing their job, right? And in those other cases in which basically they are aligning with a specific political project, an ideological political project that only seeks to punish the enemy or the rival?
Okay, that's a hard question, but let me try to be very brief. This situation of the courts in Brazil has even made the headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post. Some op-eds compared the performance of the Supreme Court in the United States with the Supreme Court in Brazil, and they basically said, well, a lot of things have happened in the U.S., but in Brazil, they were able to put Bolsonaro, the former president, in jail for a coup attempt, or in his aides as well. So I understand that a lot of people, especially after the elections of 2022 and after pretty much 4 years of Bolsonaro attacking the courts, I think that people were relieved to see that, well, regardless of who was the next president, and of course a lot of people like Lula, but a lot of people also are very suspicious of him. But the fact was, they saw, well, maybe the answer to the challenges against democracy that we have been going through is in the courts. But the problem of the courts, and let me share an anecdote. The Supreme Court justice who spearheaded the whole trial against Bolsonaro and his aides, his name is Alexandre de Moraes. Maybe if you want to write his name down, well, you can Google him up. He's become like a superstar in Brazil. Alexandre de Moraes, he is being accused by the right, and not without a reason, accused of persecuting and silencing people online. So he basically has this entire probe against the spread of fake news in Brazil, which is highly considered, and that's why Brazil's score in the freedom of the internet is actually lower than the average, because it has been considered kind of censorship in Brazil. And a lot of Brazilians, including centrist, relatively moderate Brazilians, kind of turned a blind eye to what Moraes was doing, because after all, he was the guardian of democracy. He was the one to put Bolsonaro into trial and then to imprison him. Now things are changing. And the anecdote is, yesterday, there was like the Brazilian Senate formed a special commission to analyze the rise of organized crime in Brazil. And the final report was rejected by the Senate, because in the report, the rapporteur had said that at the final outcome of the report, 3 Supreme Court justices had to be indicted for their involvement with organized crime. And because the political class is very corporatist, they kind of backed down and they rejected the report. The rapporteur might have overstepped because there's no evidence of crimes committed by the Supreme Court justices at this point. But as it turns out, there's an investigation ongoing in Brazil about a massive corruption scandal involving a bank. And the dude who owned the bank's now bankrupt, but the guy who owned the bank, and he's a combination of Madoff and Epstein, let's put it this way.
Wow.
He was able to charm every single element of the political class into his grace, let's say. And a lot of Supreme Court justices are apparently involved, including Alexandre de Moraes, whom we love because he put Bolsonaro in jail, but not so much right now because he's involved in corruption scandals. So in a way, the erosion of institutions, it's of course something that's done by authoritarians, but sometimes institutions end up eroding themselves. And one of the biggest criticisms that we have in Brazil right now about the situation of the court, the Supreme Court and the courts in general, is that the judicial branch has become a caste, like an elite that's untouchable, that's you cannot criticize them, that's threatening civilians, like the average person, because they criticize them. So I think that there's an element of authoritarianism that's very visible in many cases across Latin America and the world, but there's also some lack of discernment on the side of these courts to behave the way they behave sometimes, to imagine that in a way they are above the law when they are not. And democracy kind of presupposes that no one is above the law. So,
thank you, Guilherme. Eduardo, I turn to you, and you sounded a little bit skeptic about the new position of Bolivia in the report. And I want you to elaborate a little bit more about the institutions in Bolivia. I mean, have a new president that is hitting the right notes, I think. I actually heard him in a forum in Panama, and he certainly, was one of the most appealing, had one of the most appealing speeches. But what else needs to happen in Bolivia? What needs to in terms of institutions, what needs to happen in Bolivia to make sure that Bolivia doesn't slice back down into not free or partly free category?
Yeah. Well, I want to begin my answering by, again, going back to what Gerardo was saying at the beginning, that perhaps it's easier to move into the free category, right, than to remain in the free category, right? And that even for, long consolidated democracies, right? That's why I think that probably, to me at least, one of the most significant conclusions of this study is that the United States is right there on the border, right, these days. That what they're saying is that we have had this movement toward the unfree category or partly free, right? And that reversing that is very difficult. In the Bolivian case, right, I think what we're seeing is really a very significant moment. And I think that's why I think reports like this are actually quite useful, more from a communications perspective than anything else, right? Because it really is important to kind of support a president, a very weak president, like President Paz, who's facing enormous challenges, right? And challenges on the economic front, challenges, I mean, just basic things where Bolivia didn't have any gasoline, right? When the president was sworn in on November the 8th, and he appeared to have solved the issue, only to have had a real setback in this by virtue of the fact that the gasoline appears to have been, somewhat, I don't know, poisoned, right? Because now what the president has is a real problem with cars breaking down all over the country because this gasoline has destroyed the engines, right? So what was a tremendous public relations victory has now become a major setback for the president. And then on top of that, you have some real structural challenges that have to do with the fact that there's a judiciary that is still elected and that still remains questionable in terms of the kinds of decisions it can make, right? While one might say it's not as politicized right now as it was over the last 20 years, it still is a major problem of electing justices and judges. It's a real problem, as Mexico is going to find out, by the way, very, very quickly, and having followed the Bolivian model. And then I think, the other problem is, and this is really an issue with a country that is so heavily mobilized by the recurrence of social crises, right? And the fact that you can mobilize people against the system very quickly, block roads and the like, and particularly when the main opposition force today is occurring in the context of a collapsed party system. Parties in Bolivia today are really, Gerardo, you remember that old Bolivian invention of taxi parties, right? Parties that could hold their convention inside of a taxi cab, right? Well, Bolivia has taxi parties, and the old traditional parties have collapsed, and so you don't have that linkage between political institutions and society. And the only party that appears to be recomposing with the capacity to mobilize is, in fact, the party of the authoritarian system that we just defeated. And so, unless and tied to the drugs industry. So my concern really is that the government has a real problem in bringing to justice somebody like Evo Morales, who's been accused of pedophilia and all kinds of stuff, right? But he also happens to be still the most popular opponent and who can mobilize an extensive amount of the country electorally and then on the streets. So I think, that my concern more than anything else is that Bolivia may have reached an important transition here, but one that, is so risky, right? That it could revert in a very short period of time. By the way, I don't think there's a coup threat in Bolivia. I think that, we've long moved away from that. But there is, I think, a graver threat of political instability and really an opposition that is non-democratic more than anything else.
Thank you, Eduardo. We have around 20 minutes for questions. I will ask those of you who have questions for our panelists and for Gerardo to step up and use the mic, and please be short and identify yourself to when you make the question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll try to be short. My name is Evelyn Perez Verdia, and I'm the founder of the social impact organization called We Are Más, not the one from Bolivia, as Eduardo Gamarra often clarifies, but the one where good people who believe in democracy and free and fair elections work together to build civic participations in communities through collaborations among civil society groups, local and national organizations, and academic institutions. As someone who has traveled to Bolivia with the U.S. Department of State and has focused on teaching content creators who represent millions of Bolivian followers the importance of ethical content. I cannot tell you how happy I am to see Bolivia tell us a different story today, first of all, even though we know that there's still work to do. And why do I say this? I say this because in Latin America, we saw content creators being asked to speak about elections in other countries and offered up to $5,000 to do so. When we were there, that was one of the things we saw. Considering elections and the collaborations driven by aligned political ideologies, I am concerned about the weakening of the electoral system worldwide. And this concern grows when we hear some talk about nationalizing elections, or women working in elections, where 80% of election administrators in the US are women who are currently facing harassment. I was just an international election observer in Colombia, and we saw the same thing when I started talking to magistradas in Latin America. They were saying the same thing. So right now, additionally, commentators in US radio stations in Spanish have recently repeated false claims that the 2020 elections were fraudulent, despite many democratic institutions and organizations disproving these allegations. These narratives that started in 2020 incited violence against leaders like Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, and Mike Pence, a Republican, on January 6, 2021. So my question is, are similar narratives emerging in Americas from commentators that you may have seen? I worry that this could foster distrust in election officials and workers in the United States across the globe, also potentially undermining the electoral process and endangering their lives here in the United States and in other places. In your work, are you seeing mentions or repetitions of this in other countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn.
I guess that's to me.
Yeah.
No, thank you for your question. I think we have stopped doing, but we had another report that's interesting, but it's still online. It was called Election Integrity in the Digital Age. And it was a report that did a pre-assessment of elections around the world. It could be parliamentarian elections, local elections, or presidential elections. And our research team actually devised something that is called the Vulnerability Index. And it's, again, 0 to 100 to understand what are some of the risks in that election that voters and the international community should be aware of. And this was done maybe 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks prior to the election. And topics like this actually came up in many elections. We actually did the United States, both the midterm and the presidential, as well as other countries. That data is still there for you to look at it if you want to see some of the areas. But the 3 main buckets that we analyze in this tool had to do with, let's say, the digital dimension, social media, what you were talking about. The role of organized crime was another one, or non-state actors in trying to influence the election. And the third one was certainly the issue of, I'm not going to say misinformation or disinformation, but how even was the playing field prior to the election regarding basically policies and positions of the candidates. And so, unfortunately, we have no more funding for that, but certainly we're looking for more funding, and academic institutions in particular could be interested in this. But to answer your question, yes, we have different from the Freedom in the World, of course, but certainly focus on particular pre-assessment elections all over the world in which we found issues like the ones you highlighted. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My name is Adam Reitslaff. I'm the founder of Pan American Strategic Advisors. We often talk about democratic erosion because of the speed at which it happens, but it underlies a reality, which is these aren't eroding, it's an attack. There are institutions that are being attacked by people and politicians across the region. But more importantly, these are politicians that are often elected and come to power because we, the people, vote for politicians that are going to attack these institutions. So my question for each of you is, what are 2 policies that you would recommend to make sure that democracy delivers for the people of the Americas?
Anyone can take that? Or
yeah, I haven't answered that. Please, I encourage you others. I mean, one recommendation that we had in our report, which is globally being highlighted as a challenge for democracy is let's say the apathy that particularly young people are showing for or against democracy. And when I talk about young people, it is the UN definition of youth, which is people from 18 to 24. In fact, actually, I've written an article that is public in the blog, in which young people are not voting, they're not joining political parties, they're not joining social movements, but nonetheless, they have a tremendous desire to contribute with ideas to organizations. So that is one recommendation that we actually have in the report. The other one, yesterday I was in the Brookings Institute talking about another region, which is Africa, which is much more complex. And a great example came about how to renew basically democratic governance. And it was between Nigeria and between Senegal. And the indicator there was basically the number of women in decision-making power in Nigeria, which was 10%, which is a huge country, 240,000 million, versus Senegal, actually, who had almost achieved parity, nearly 46%. And certainly how that reflected, at least in our index, because Nigeria is partially free, whereas Senegal actually is one of these countries, particularly because it has one of the youngest democratically elected leaders at 45, makes that particular difference. So it's part of this renewal in a sense. And last but not least, I would say this recommendation about reimagining the ecosystem of democratic governance. I think systems have reached basically their limit, including the United States, actually. There's, in fact, actually studying the Brookings Institute in terms of what is the number of representatives at the federal level that the US should have now based on its demographics. And it's not 540 or 20. It actually triples that. And so where's the political will to reform that, for example? And on the US, which Eduardo mentioned, I just want to we are seeing the trend in the US in our data to actually be a trajectory over the last 12 years. And it is actually both under Democratic and Republican administrations. And so the trend actually, the US has lost 12 points in our index over the past 10 years, actually. Yeah, so.
Félix, Eduardo, or Guilherme wanted to add to that?
Yeah. If I may, because I'm already here in my class of global democratic ecosystems, and in fact, he has joined this conversation report. I really enjoy, Gerardo, when you mentioned the democracy as an ecosystem. And back to the wonderful question from the audience, that's precisely the way what we should tackle the problem, not only as the erosion of the executive power. And you can think of many countries around the world that actually have points in the Freedom of the World report, but they continue to fight back because they had, for example, robust municipal. We see a lot of the democracy declining in terms of the political parties. We see that they have a robust judicial system. We see in other parts of the world that despite having high levels of corruption, you may have a decent police forces. So I think that tackling democracy as an ecosystem is one of the elements. And on a final note, as one of the things that we have been addressing a lot, the Futures Project, there's one element that you will find every single that on the world report polarized media. So I invite read the dialogue about democracies. On a final note, it's easier to bring democracy back when a country is still democratic. So early they note I must apologize with you. I need to and consider you. Thank you, Freedom House. It's always a pleasure. And my dear friend Eduardo, it's always great to see you as well as a fellow panelist.
Thank you, Felix. Eric?
Yeah, Eric De La Fuente, Senior Research Fellow at the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom. Of course, I teach here as well at the Green School. First, it's great, Gerardo. We met earlier for coffee. It's almost deja vu for me because when I did my PhD, I had to read every freedom of the world and every freedom of the press study that came out since the 1980s. Since I used it as a basis. So that was, we were talking earlier this morning. I want to just touch back because with Eduardo, we co-direct a big study on risk, political risk, economic risk, social risk, and so on. And a point that was made was that it's probably easier to get into the free category than to maintain there. And one of the things we've been seeing in our study, and we've been developing this trustometer, is in trust in institutions, which is now at an all-time low. And that has a direct correlation because what we see is that for the most part, people want democracy. They believe in actually the electoral commissions and so on, and transparency of the democracy. But the trust in democratic institutions is on the floor across the board, almost in the entire region. And one of the things that we see and of course, you touched on a lot of things, and when we look at democratic backsliding, we tend to focus on other things that repress freedom of the press or freedom of association or civil rights and so on. But it's a state capacity to resolve day-to-day problems of people. And that has lowered the trust in a number of areas, or to deal with crime, or to work with organized crime, or unemployment, and so on. So the perception of the public actually influences a lot and opens the door for non-democratic forces or that get elected and eventually erodes power. So how much do you think actually is the state capacity to resolve issues as well influence democratic backsliding because of the results that the window of opportunity? We were talking to whether it's President Paz or whether it's Noboa in Ecuador or even Milei in Argentina or so on, newly elected presidents, the window of opportunity to show results is small. And because the trust level is so low right now, that can open the door for elements that can, political elements that can get to democratic backsliding. So how much do you think public perception and state capacity to be able to resolve, day-to-day problems can impact democratic backsliding moving forward?
Question, and nice to see Eric, and certainly the report that you and Eduardo are putting together is another one of these reports that I would say can lead us into practical solutions. I think the complexities of today's ecosystem are such that one report or one indicator actually is not enough. So I'm looking forward to your next report and certainly to find ways of collaborating. I think our methodology does not per se assess government performance. What it assesses is really the guarantee of conditions for people actually to feel free. And maybe a number of indicators related to risk indirectly are related to prosperity in a sense. And certainly, I didn't do the exercise, but I guarantee you in your own studies, if we cross with our data, we will find that there is less risk in free countries and there is more risk in not-free countries. The question is, what are some of the policy issues that we can find in each case? Because the other thing that the ecosystem has shown over this past 50 years is that each system is actually developing in their own way, in a sense. For example, in Latin America and the Americas, I would say, and I know Eduardo, he has done a little bit of work on this, a lot of our systems are not necessarily presidential by nature. They're actually parliamentary by nature. Bolivia is one of the cases, and Peru, obviously, is another one of these cases that they even have the figure of a prime minister, in a sense, right, to run the government versus the president to run actually the state. And I think all of these studies, plus indicators about particularly how young people, I think if you find the OECD, and I'm sure you show this also in your assessment, young people all over the OECD countries actually have the least trust in government performance. And that is because perhaps they're not seeing basically government working to their expectations. I always use the example of the former president of Chile, right? Who was an instigator. He was a protester. He became famous because he led a group of young people protesting the increase of public transportation, if you remember. And then, yeah, right. And then when he became president, as one of the youngest presidents, he found in reality that governing actually, governing is already hard, but governing democratically is even harder, because he tried twice to do a constitutional reform and he failed. And hopefully in his memoirs, he will actually reflect on the fact that, yes, it's good to protest, it's good to social movements, but certainly you have to lower sometimes the expectations to understand the capacity of governments to actually deliver. And this is why also somebody mentioned in Felix, the issue of decentralized and local governments are becoming more important. This is the case of Bolivia, for example, that Eduardo was mentioning, where no longer La Paz is really the power of economics or political power, but now there are a number of epicenters who are challenging that, including basically the region of Santa Cruz. So great question, and certainly there is an interaction there, and please keep up the good work on your study. It's very much needed. Yeah.
Can I just chime in? Your question was great, and I think that at the end of the day, if we really want to understand the future of democracy in Latin America, we have to look at the trust in institutions index, because that's the most important thing. It's true for Brazil, and I think it's true for most Latin American countries. If you ask people how much they trust the Senate, like Congress in general, the courts or parties, it's always going to be very low. Where is their trust right now? In the church, irrespective of what kind of church it is, evangelical, Catholic, doesn't matter. Church, the military, and that's quite interesting because it speaks directly to state capacity, and businesses. So in a way, there's no way to go around these forces if you're thinking about a truly democratic landscape, right? And there's no way to exclude the military because they protect people ultimately, or churches because they provide some sort of comfort to people. And that's something that most people overlook. I mean, the role of churches, there has to be a dialogue between the state or governments and churches, because the churches are, at the end of the day, those who will deliver some of the goods that the state cannot provide alone. And it's interesting because in many ways, we see these forces like opposing each other when they were supposed to complement each other. And maybe democracy can only regain its trust if it really starts talking to society and societal forces in general, right?
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Gabriela Reuses. I am a student here at FIU for International Relations. First, I would like to express my gratitude to the Screening School. This spaces like this one make me feel not only represented as a student, but also provide spaces for me to learn more about the politics in the region that I come from. I'm Colombian, and 20 years ago, I was 1 year old. So I did not know a lot about the situations that you're talking about, but I learned in class and I learned while I was researching before coming here. And my question for you is, the last 4 months of this year have been very eventful, to say the least. They have presented a lot of changes in the international and global arena, not only for Latin America, but the whole world. I wanted to ask, what did this mean for the permanence of the rest of the year and for the study and the report that you're probably going to provide next year? I mean, this affects indicators that were discussed today, and obviously bring a lot of questions to the table, not only from students, but also from people that actively participate in democracy. Another thing that I wanted to ask, and goes with the question, is, are these changes permanent, or do you think by the end of the year, we're just going to go back to the situation that we were January 1st before January 3rd? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, our schedule is very tight, actually. We're beginning to do, to collect data basically for our 2027 report, which it always releases either in February or March. And we have the whole calendar year really to prepare. One thing that we're considering, because things happen really while we're preparing the report, which I don't think we made a decision yet, but we want to do maybe quarterly updates, if that's the correct concept. Kind of bring in a little bit our findings to perspective of what has happened in the past 3 months. And certainly, you're right, there's a lot that actually to cover just in the last 4 months, which certainly I don't know if you can wait for another 12 months, but certainly they'll be reflected actually, not only in the global context. I think last year we did a good analysis about what was changing also in the global context of for democracy, and it wasn't really that good of story, but also in terms of specific countries in terms of their indices. Now, all of you who have done indexes, you need to look really long term, allowing you to have basically 10-year, 5-year, 20-year, even 30-year timelines. And that's what the databases are very important, is actually give you the perspective, because you can see the trends. I show the trends of Mexico, Salvador, Nicaragua. You couldn't see that in this year's report, but if we stretch it to 20, you can see really where the beginning of the end actually happened. So the other thing I want to encourage you, I've often speak to young people, and I think I thank you for you to choose basically this area for your studies. We need you. I think basically there's a lot of discouragement right now among students of international affairs saying, what am I going to be this for? What is the future for me? Quite to the contrary, you are going to be the shapers basically of what happens in the future. And thank you for having chosen this and continue the good work.
Thank you for your words, Gerardo. Well, we're over the time. I just want to give opportunity to our panelists if they want to add anything to the discussion to wrap up. Guilherme, Eduardo?
Sure, I'll take the opportunity to kind of wrapping up three things. Number one, going back to the question of what can be done, right? Gerardo and all of us in our careers have been shaped by the very significance of soft power in foreign policy making, and how soft power was really very important in the transition from authoritarianism, and then in the let's call it the building of democracy in Latin America, right? The even FIU played a key role, in things like electoral reform, judicial reform, political party reform, all of the studies on corruption that many of us in that room were involved in. That is gone today, and that I think is an enormous concern. The collapse of soft power is really problematic. Okay, and that number one. Number two. Many of you mentioned the problems with political trust, right? Or trust in political institutions. That is no longer a Latin American phenomenon. It's no longer a South problem. Now we have, in fact, you might even argue that the United States has some levels of institutional trust that are worse than institutional trust in some of the countries in Latin America. Now, these are driven by things like, for example, the terrible handling of the communications with the Iran conflict and so on, right? And so I think, and Gerardo I think is extraordinarily correct and influential with his study by looking at these long-term trends. Yes, a 3-month trend is not really a trend, right? In the sense. But what Gerardo's study tells us is pointing out that the U.S. has a 12-year trend, that it's not only a Republican issue, it's a structural issue that we're facing, as many countries have been facing. And that can only be seen when you have this 12-year data cycle, right? Where you can really plot how this deterioration has gone. So I think it's an enormously important warning that Gerardo tells us, right? A short-term trend is not really that significant, but if you look at this, and especially if you look at trends that transcend a single party in office, that's where I begin to get concerned, with a very low levels of trust in institutions, right? And we all know, political scientists have been studying this for decades, that probably one of the greatest indicators of democratic stability is trust in institutions. And right now we're at that threshold where really it appears to be irreversible. So sorry. Thank you.
Good. Thank you, Eduardo. Guilherme?
And we cannot forget that elections in themselves are an institution, right? I think that the trend, and of course, this year's report, but the trend as provided by Freedom House shows that countries that are rolling back to a situation of authoritarianism or partially free countries, they are governed or have been governed by people who have given up on democracy, either because they are actively authoritarian leaders or because they just don't care and they're okay with like making pacts with those who are not committed to democracy in the first place. I think that the only antidote to this is when people start to realize that who put these politicians in power in the first place are the people who vote. So people have, I mean, I think that the duty of all of us, I still don't vote here, I vote in Brazil, but it's to exercise your voting power, because that's not the only thing you have, but the best thing you have. And we cannot give up on democracy, because if people don't give up on democracy, of course, our leaders will reflect a very different kind of governing structure and political institutions. So I think that that's what the report in the long run kind of tells us. And well, there's hope.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gerardo, closing remarks on you?
Yeah, no, thank you again for organizing this, and Dean in particular. Actually, I think we should continue these conversations in other levels. There's a lot, as you know, 1 hour and a half we found is not enough. We can devote probably just the same time to just one country or one issue in one country. But I like the fact that this is university driven and it is speaking really to the core values of what the university is. And I want to again thank you for making this possible. Thank the dean and your team. And let's do it again, actually, very soon.
You know, on behalf of the good. Thank you.
Gracias. Gracias.
Thank you.
Sí.
Well, thank you all for.
Chao, Gerardo, gracias.
Chao, Eduardo.
you.
Ya te escribo. Sí.
Listo,
Un
gracias.
abrazo.
Bye bye.